In 1970, £6,500 could buy you a house. In 2023, it can buy you this, the Sony Alpha 1. It's Sony's flagship camera. It's a jack of all trades and a master of each one. Arguably, it is the best hybrid camera you can buy right now, but it's a 2-year-old camera. Is it still carrying the worth that it did 2 years ago? And is it any better than the camera I'm filming on right now, the GH5? I want to find that out to see whether I should actually finally switch to Sony or should I stay with Panasonic. I think we should go and test this thing out. Let's go. And quick disclaimer before the comment section are filling up saying I've bought this camera and I don't know what I'm talking about. Sony sent me this camera free of charge, but they didn't pay me or tell me how to make the video or put any comments in about the camera. Anyway, let's get onto the video. Now, before we get into it, I'm going to give you some quick fire specs of the Sony Alpha 1. First up, we have the 50.1 megapixel full frame sensor. We have 8K at 30 FPS, 4K at 120 FPS with a 1.1x crop, and 5 stops of stabilization, which is actually the same as my Panasonic GH5, which is on the floor over there, which came out in 2017, I believe. So just shows you how far ahead of the game. Personally, I think that Panasonic were the IBIS in that camera. Incredible. This camera, pretty good. You can play around with the stabilization modes. If you put the stabilization onto off, it will look a little bit janky and probably not usable. If you put it on active, it will crop in a little bit and it will seem quite smooth. I just leave it on the middle setting. It's a great middle ground. As you can see, it stabilizes but doesn't crop in, so you get the best of both worlds. It can shoot 30 FPS stills. 30 frames a second, uncompressed RAW and JPEG. That's pretty good. That is incredible for sports photography. I know a lot of people that I have worked with and know through my work with Getty that will love this and have been using this camera for at least 2 years. It's been incredible for them. The A1 also has 750 AF points, 425 contrast detection points, so that basically covers 90% of the image. So this is an example of 8K, and as you can see, loads of room, high resolution. But I'm going to be honest with you, you're actually watching 4K footage right now. I've just cropped it at 200%. This is 8K, and look how much space you have to work with text, animations, graphics, and it still looks good when you crop straight back in again to 4K. This is one of the key elements of shooting in 8K. You can get that flexibility in post to just crop in and make it seem like you're shooting from a different perspective, make it seem like you're shooting from 2 different cameras, when actually you're just cropping in post. Very clever. All right, this is me in the edit. I've just noticed I forgot to say something about shooting in 8K. Whilst it gives you the flexibility, the file sizes are obviously going to be massive. And it reminds me of when 4K was introduced and everyone felt the same and said the same things about 4K as they're saying about 8K now. For me, at the time when I bought my GH5, the camera could shoot 4K and everyone was saying shoot in 1080, smaller file sizes, it looks just as good, which didn't actually turn out to be true, it was complete rubbish. So I ended up shooting all my stuff in 4K and everything that I shoot was always in 4K. For example, the racer documentary that I did in 2018, all shot in 4K. Both myself and Kieran, who was helping me film and produce it, he was shooting in 4K as well. And I knew that doing that, we would have larger file sizes, but we would also have much higher image quality. And that was the most important thing to me, is to have an image that will last the test of time. So I think shooting in 8K now, even if you down-res it to 4K, is still more beneficial than not using 8K at all, just because of the file size. Just something that I thought was worth adding. Also, can we talk about how crisp the 4K is and also the 8K? Just looks ridiculous. Even when I crop into 200% 8K, which is 4K, it still looks fantastic. I think this opens up a whole new world of possibilities when you're editing in 8K. This machine handles 8K like a champ, but I think when you throw too much at it, it might explode. And I don't want it to explode, so maybe in the future, I'll have to keep that in mind. Just something for people to remember when you're editing 8K. It's going to be very intense, twice as much as 4K. Back to the video. Now we've gone through the specs, let's have a look at the pros of the Sony Alpha 1. The first one is huge amounts of detail, not just in stills, but also in video. I love the fact that shooting in 8K, you can crop right in and you can frame and make different angles from just having one 8K image. It gives you so much more flexibility, and even if you wanted to export in 4K 8K downres to 4K will still look better than native 4K, if that even makes sense. The A1 has an extremely fast sensor, which means it can process all the information compared to something like my GH5, which has a slower sensor. As I mentioned earlier, 30 FPS stills gives you so much opportunity, especially when you're working in sports. And I love the fact that you can just shoot RAW and JPEG at 30 FPS. That is such a game changer. And the mechanical shutter on here isn't even that loud, I don't think. You can always use the electronic shutter. You can shoot in silent mode on the electronic shutter, which will be advantageous for sports like golf, snooker, tennis, where you want to have the shutter be extremely quiet. The main other pro that I've listed is 4K 120. It does have a 1.1x crop, but the autofocus in slow-mo. It's such a small thing, but it makes such a huge difference to me. I know it's been around on Sony cameras for many years, but I've never ever had that on my Panasonic camera. So I've always had to manually focus whenever I've done 4K 60 or 1080 120. I haven't been able to do slow-mo with autofocus. To me, it's just an absolute game changer, and I'm looking forward to testing this out, and I'll show a few example clips on the screen right now. And as you can see, the autofocus is picking her up perfectly. I set it to animal mode and it absolutely nails on every single time. So you might be thinking, with all these pros, are there any cons with the Sony Alpha 1? And unfortunately, there is one massive one for me personally. It's such a small and silly thing that causes quite big problems when you're using this camera. For example, right now I'm shooting on a tripod. I have the camera looking straight at me, but I have no idea whether this is in focus. It could be completely muzzed, it could be unusable, but I'm guessing, having used it for a few days, that that won't be the case, and I'm trusting the Alpha 1 to do its job and track me and keep me sharp. So the screen on the back of the Sony A1 only tilts and pulls out of the camera. It doesn't articulate round and flip round like a flippy screen. This is such a small thing that will cause quite a few problems for someone who is shooting like I am right now. Whereas on my GH5, I can just flip the screen round, I can check the levels, I can check my exposure, I can check everything's working fine. On the Alpha 1, you don't have a clue unless you're behind the camera. I know they've done this because they probably have thought about photographers more than video. However, it is a hybrid camera, and if you're going to shoot photographers, you need to include videographers in that, because I'm always a video first man, photos come second. But I know a lot of people out there, particularly the people that I work with, are the other way around, photo first, and they never ever look at the screen. They're always looking through the viewfinder to compose their shot. So I understand why they've done it, but I mean, come on. Just put a screen on there that flips around so I can see what I'm filming myself. That would please everyone, and this would be very, very close to being the perfect camera. I don't know if this is a con, but the autofocus is great, but can it compete with the new Sony A7R5's AI autofocus? I'm really interested to see how incredible that autofocus is when I get to test that camera out, hopefully very soon. It will be able to tell me whether I should get the A7R5 or whether I should even stay away from Sony, because I'm really intrigued to see how this autofocus compares to the A1. The A1 autofocus is great, but imagine if the A1 had AI autofocus, tracking like the eye and predicting where the body's going. That would be incredible. Now, the last con I have is a pretty obvious one. This is an incredible camera, but it will empty your wallet, and fast. If you want a decent setup like a 24-70 as well as the body on its own is £6,500 as of recording in January 2023. You can drop another £2,500 on a Sony G Master lens, a 24-70, a 16-35, or a 70-200. If you buy all three of those, we're looking well over £10,000 for just a camera setup. Understandably, sports pros and photographers and pro videographers are not going to blink an eyelid at this, and they'll just invest. But if you're looking at getting this camera and you're starting out, or you're near the start of your journey in terms of creating content, this is not the camera for you. It's too early. Work out how you can use your current camera, or maybe a camera that's lower down in the Sony line, and you'll benefit so much more. And then when you get to the stage where you can afford this, buy it, and then you'll be able to use it for years and years to come, because I'm sure this camera is going to last a very long time. I know pretty much no one's going to be interested in this, but I'm going to cover it in 30 seconds. The comparison to my current camera, the Panasonic GH5, which came out in 2017, 6 years ago. Can you believe 2017 was 6 years ago? I got the GH5 in 2018, and it has been an almost perfect camera for me. It's been able to shoot video at a really high rate, 4K, beautiful colors. It has a flip out screen, the battery life is great. But the main problem with this camera is the autofocus. The autofocus was terrible. I never got on with the autofocus, and you could never rely on it, and sometimes you had to even go manual. and see if you can do it yourself. That's the main difference between the A1 and the GH5. It's almost a silly comparison to make because they're in two completely different pricing brackets. The A1 is probably camera number one in the world of hybrid cameras. The GH5 is probably sunk quite low now. Another benefit of the A1 over my GH5 is low light performance. If I go above 800 ISO on my GH5, you can see some pretty noticeable grain, whereas I can crank up this camera, it seems like I can go well over 10,000 ISO and it's still usable. You can do some noise reduction in post, but if you're looking to just shoot and get something done quickly, I think around 10,000 ISO is usable. Going over that, I'm not quite sure it would be usable, but you might be able to regain it back in post if you need to. I've never used the Sony a7S III, but having seen the comparison clips, I think the A1 is on par with the a7S III in terms of low light, but in terms of video low light, yeah, I think the a7S III is probably slightly ahead. So as you can see, this is S-Log3, very flat, very bland. Photographers watching this will think, what am I looking at right now? This is S-Log3, and the benefit of shooting in S-Log is that everything's very flat, but when it's shot slightly overexposed, you keep all the detail in the sky and the clouds, so when you slide across an adjustment layer and grade it, this is what it looks like. It looks so much better than how it looks out the box, and it gives you a lot of flexibility in post. I've done 3 keepy uppies, that's incredible. I used to be good at playing football. Now I'm behind the camera. I've actually just switched the picture profile to S Cinetone, so you should see a little bit of a difference now in 8K. I thought I had it on, I didn't. It's just me learning the menus. By the way, the menus are actually a lot simpler than I first looked at. When I opened this box and got the camera out, went through the menus, it was very, very overwhelming, a bit confusing, and it took me a good day to separate all the stuff that I needed and the stuff that I didn't need. I actually really like the Sony menu system. It's really good. In terms of what this camera can do in photography, let's look at some comparisons between my GH5 and the Sony A1. And as you can see, straight out the box, the 50.1 megapixel sensor helps massively. A lot more detail, you can have a lot more creative play around in post with the amount of pixels that you have. And also with the sensor size, you can let a lot more light in. You don't have to worry about boosting the ISO up so much. And to me, that was the main problem with the GH5. You boost up the ISO over 800, you're going to be looking at some bad grain. My first impressions of looking at the stills on this camera is actually that it's a little bit contrasty straight out of the box in photo mode, and you might have to sort of dial it back a little bit. I personally think the Panasonic has the colors nailed down, 10 out of 10, but that might be because I've just used Panasonic since 2017 and I haven't looked back. But I personally like the Panasonic style, but the A1 does trump it in terms of photography. It's not really close. Then again, we are comparing a full frame camera to a micro four thirds camera, and everyone knows that the micro four thirds is a lot smaller sensor than a full frame camera. So overall, is the Sony A1 worth £6,500? I would say yes, if you're going to get the most out of it. If you are a hybrid shooter, if you're doing sports photography, fast action, you need that 30 frames per second. If you're doing video where you need 8K and you're going to be cropping in post and you need that extra resolution. If you're questioning whether you're that person that needs the extra resolution, you're probably not that person. Get something like the A7R5, the A7S III if you're into video. It's just about picking your price point. For example, you could almost buy an A7S III and an A7R5 and you'd just be spending a little bit more than what this camera costs on its own. That way you would have the stills photography of the 60 megapixel camera of the A7R5, you'd have an 8K video on the A7R5, the AI autofocus, and on the A7S III you'd have the best video camera there is. So you'd have the best of both worlds, but it's all about picking where you are in the market, what suits your price range. And for me, the A1 is incredible and I would love to buy it, but I think it's a little bit too much for what it is. So whilst I probably won't be buying the Sony A1, don't let that discourage you. If you are someone that needs the extra resolution, you need the 30 frames per second, maybe you're doing sports photography, you're doing action photography, you are doing video where you need the extra resolution, you'll know if this camera is for you. And with that, I'm going to stop my keepy uppies. I'm going to go inside. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Sony, for sending me the camera. See you soon. Final one. This is for the Americans. If you don't like football wear, we use the feet. We'll use this football instead. This is my Russell Wilson impression. And that was a perfect spiral. Like a fire, we're gonna